Okay, let's talk about the interconnections between environment and our health. So, things we take for granted. As you can see from this diagram, our environmental conditions can affect whether we are healthy or not. It can also determine the economic growth of a country. It can also determine how long we are going to live. It's going to affect our reproductive health. Conditions in our environment can affect our reproductive health. And conditions in our environment is not going to have the same consequences on everybody. Poor people tends to be more affected by adverse climate outcomes, by global warming, by floods, by air pollution, by water pollution. And because of that, these may affect the social cohesion in a given society or community. People may not always be happy because when they see another group of people are more privileged, are more protected, and they bear all the consequences of all these adverse environmental effects. So it's going to affect the unity of any society. Our environmental conditions, whether the state of water and air, whether it's clean or polluted, can determine the risk for different communicable diseases like STDs, flus, measles, tuberculosis, and rabies. And these can in turn determine in the long run the developmental prospect of a society or a country or a location. If people are sick with all these diseases, they cannot be productive. This is going to affect the economic prospect of that region. Environmental conditions can be like unclean water or poor sanitation or changes in land use, like having new breeding grounds. These can determine or influence the risk for all these diseases, and which in turn affects the economic development of a state, of a county, of a city, of a town, of the country as a whole. And environmental intervention can lead to a reduction in global disease burden. And this disease can include acute respiratory infection. Wow, if people care for their environment, it can reduce acute respiratory infection for as much as 60%. And if people care for their environment, it can reduce instances of diarrheal disease until 90%. It can also somewhat reduce chronic respiratory conditions. And it can also reduce instances of malaria. This is why it is important for us to care about our environments. And people migrate to other places within a country to a different country due to different reasons. And sometimes people migrate because there is a change in political regimes. And when people migrate, it's a no-brainer. They will bring whatever they have with them to a new location. And this has been manifested in the diphtheria outbreak in Eastern Europe a while ago. This is due to migration. The diphtheria outbreak in Eastern Europe is due to migration to that area. And our environmental conditions, it can be change in the quality of water, air, change in hygiene, sanitation, change in the extent of pollution, global warming, climate change, can be anything. Our environmental conditions in that area can change people's health outcomes. People can either be healthier if environmental conditions improve. People can get sicker if environmental conditions deteriorate in that area. When this happens, this is going to affect the success of the attempts of the government in that location to eradicate poverty. If environment change for the better, poverty eradication may be more successful. If environmental conditions deteriorate and people become more unhealthy and less productive, it's going to affect the government's poverty eradication efforts, and changes in people's health in that location can also affect the development prospect of that region, that area. And poverty eradication is also connected with the development prospect of that location. And environmental change sometimes can lead to improve in urban health, like Europe 200 years ago, in the 19th century to the earlier 20th century, they start having piped water and sewage. This led to an improvement in health in the urban areas in many European countries. The introduction of DDT spray in Sri Lanka has ceased or minimized mosquitoes inbreeding. This has also caused improvement in the health of many Sri Lankan urban areas. And environmental change can also take the form of public health interventions, like improvement in water and sewage or DDT spraying. Living in crowded conditions or congested conditions, usually due to poverty, can increase the spread of diseases like TB and typhoid. And sometimes interventions can also include improvements in the transportation system. This may be a good thing because maybe agricultural products, they can be shipped to other areas. They can be shipped from the rural areas to the cities or to other areas that need these products. And these products may not be rotten in that area because they are good road system, they are good truck system, good transportation system to bring these products to another area. But improvement in transportation system can also lead to the spread of different diseases like STD, HIV, and AIDS, or just any diseases to other areas as people travel from one area to another. And migration, due to whatever reason, can affect people's accessibility and affordability of healthcare. Maybe migrating to other areas can lead to improvement in job prospect. And because of that, that person may be more able to afford healthcare. But migration to another area can also cause the person to have a hard time looking for a job, especially in cases of cross-country migration, where the person's credential may not be transferable to another country. And because of that, the person may not be eligible for healthcare through his or her work, even if the person can get a job. So, because of that, the person may not be able to access healthcare, and the person cannot afford healthcare in the new country of destination. And these are the most critical components of air pollutants: sulfur dioxide, where it is used for burning oil and coal, but it's not good for our environment. Particulate matter, like domestic fires, power, and industrial plants. And particulate matter can also come from diesel engines. Another air pollutants can be carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide, like petrol fumes. Ozone is another main air pollutants. It comes from emission-generated smoke and atmospheric lead. These can come through burning leaded petrol or coal. It's also another air pollutant. And this can be one of the reasons why people are starting to introduce electronic vehicles. And people living in densely populated areas and growing cities are more likely to be affected by these air pollutants. Okay. So, sometimes urbanization, modernization, industrialization comes with invention of different tools, gadgets, electronic products, including vehicles. But increased automobile ownership may not be a good thing. To that location is a no-brainer. These can cause more air pollution to that area. And indoor air pollutants like soot from burning wood. Sometimes people in certain, especially less developed countries, may still use burning wood to heat up their homes, to cook, and to do other things. Dung, frog residues, and coal are another sources of air pollutants, and acid rain is another big no-no. And one time, Thailand had acid rain, and because of that, Nike factories in Thailand, they produce a lot of shoes and other products. All these products were being stuck in the garages of Nike, and they could not be exported, shipped to other countries because of acid rain. And because of that, this tells us that why corporations, factories, business owners got to allocate, if they are able to, certain proportions of their budget to improve the environments of that area. It is important for them to work with the local government to try to minimize problems related to global warming, air pollution, water pollution, among other things. And chemical dissolved in precipitation can increase corrosive effect. This can increase instances of acid rain, and this in turn leads to less productive lands and waterways. This in turn affects plants and animals in that area because the chemical balance of these areas are being altered or changed. And this ultimately affects food production. We may have less food in terms of quality and quantity, because when plants and animals are affected, these can affect the photosynthesis process, which can in turn affect the quality and quantity of food being produced in that area. And as you can see, many environmental problems are due to human activities. and this includes unsafe disposal of heavy metals. This can increase a person's risk for arsenic and cadmium cancer. This can also lead to genetic damage due to the presence of mercury. This can also increase a person's risk for brain and bone damage due to the presence of copper, lead, and mercury. So, as you can see, environmental conditions can affect our health outcomes. And this is another example where our human activities affects environmental conditions. The use of leaded petrol can lead to lead pollution. These in turn can lower the level of our intelligence, especially for unborn infants, for toddlers, for young kids. And this affects the lowering of one's intelligence can accumulate from childhood to adulthood to old age. And because of that, the person cannot work, cannot make a decent living. This in turn can lead to productivity loss. So as you can see from this example, environmental condition is intertwined with a location's economic prospects. And this is another example where human beings can affect the activities of human beings can affect environmental conditions. The use of unsafe nuclear power can contaminate the surrounding areas through radiation exposure. And because of radiation exposure, these can increase the risk for thyroid cancers and other reproductive disorders for people living in that area. These can increase the person's likelihood of being infertile, and this can increase the people's chances of birth defects. And some of these conditions can include cleft palate, Down syndrome, deformed limbs, and organs. So these are the examples of birth defects we are talking about. So one example of the use of unsafe nuclear power would be Chernobyl that happened in USSR or Ukraine a long time ago. They contaminate the areas. And because of radiation, now people living in that area have increased risk for thyroid cancer and other reproductive disorders. And it's a no-brainer. Environmental factors have the most effects on the poor because the poor are often lack access to healthcare and they cannot afford quality care. So if they have higher risk for all these health conditions and this affected their intelligence, or they have some of these health conditions we just talked about, they are unable to afford quality treatment so that they can get better. It's a no-brainer. And the poor people are more likely to live near these hazardous or polluted areas. Factories by foreign nationals, multinationals, franchises, and factories. If they dispose their hazardous materials into the rivers, it's going to pollute the air and the water. And the poor people in those areas are more likely to be affected. The rich people often do not live near those polluted or hazardous areas. They live in a more secluded areas. and they are more able to afford healthcare. It's a no-brainer. They live in their mansions in and upper-class neighborhoods. This is why adverse environmental conditions often affect the poor. This is what we mean by environmental justice. And because of that, we need to, different stakeholders need to collaborate to improve the environmental conditions for the poor. And oftentimes the impact begins before birth, and they can spread across generations, especially if people do not move out from those areas. This can increase a person's risk for pregnancy failures through agricultural and industrial chemicals and through other organic pollutants. And this can also lead to childhood development difficulties because of all these chemicals and pollutants. And these chemicals and pollutants also have genetic impacts. And these often occur through nuclear radiation and heavy metals. And because women, they do a lot of things inside the house, outside the house. Imagine women in rural areas, women in less developed countries, in secluded areas. They do a lot of things around the house, and sometimes their efforts may not be recognized. And sometimes they also have to work outside their homes to supplement their family incomes. And sometimes these women are the sole breadwinner of their household. And because of all these reasons, they are more vulnerable to ill health, infections, respiratory diseases. This is especially so for young women, for women who are near their reproductive years, in the late teens to the early 30s. This is what a woman's reproductive years normally are. And women with a lot of children are also more vulnerable to ill health and infections. And in some countries or some societies that are highly patriarchal, where women do not have the autonomy to negotiate safe sex, they essentially have to do what their spouse or partner wants them to do. And because of that, they are also more vulnerable to HIV and AIDS. They can get infected through their spouse, and a vertical transmission can also happen. If they get pregnant, they can transmit AIDS to their infants even before the baby was born. And some environmental burdens are seasonal. In some countries, they have rainy seasons. During these seasons, people in these regions have higher risk of waterborne diseases and insect-borne diseases. And sometimes certain areas of the country can be cooler, like countries with 4 seasons, or even in tropical countries. Monsoon season tends to be cooler than drought seasons. And because of the seasonal change, certain regions of the country tends to be overcrowded in certain seasons. When this happens, the risk for infectious diseases can increase when it's cooler or when it is overcrowded. A recent example would be, we know COVID. Even now, things more or less ease up. And the later variants are less severe. But when it is cooler, during autumn or winter, there are still more cases of COVID and flu. COVID and flu are also examples of infectious diseases. And this is another example where human activities can affect environmental conditions. This is done through the process of industrialization. Because of industrialization, this can lead to the release of new chemicals. Some of these chemicals can also be endocrine disruptors. These can in turn affect the fetal and childhood development in the person's early years. These can ultimately undermine the person's intelligence when the person progresses from infanthood or early childhood to adulthood. And these can also decrease the person's resistance to infective agents. These can compromise the person's immune system, and this can impair the person's reproduction, leading to infertility or birth defects. When all this happens in years to come, in decades to come, this may reduce the population of that area. And when a person's intelligence is undermined, this is going to affect the person's productivity at work. 1 or 2 decades later, this is going to ultimately affect the prosperity and economic development of that location. So here are the examples of endocrine disruptive chemicals. Phthalates. I cannot pronounce this. It comes from shampoo, hairsprays, nail polisher, and cosmetics. Phthalates. I think this is how it's being pronounced. So certain chemicals in our shampoo, hairspray, nail polisher, or cosmetics can be hazardous. And nowadays, we see some manufacturers or even sometimes medical professionals have their own products. They are trying to come up with alternatives to these products that are more environmentally friendly and safer to use. They don't cause harm to a person's health. PCBs, it came from contaminated watersheds. It also comes from disposal sites and landfills. And one other endocrine disruptive chemicals would be dioxins. They come from paper products. And that's another one, pesticides. As we know, if somebody sprays pesticides, it can increase crop production, but this can lead to all kinds of adverse health outcomes. It's a no-brainer. And the presence of these endocrine disruptive chemicals, the ones we see from here, can affect fetal and child development. This can increase the person's chance of being infertile, unable to have children. This can increase the risk for miscarriages. This can also lead to decline in sperm count. This can also increase the person's risk for prostate cancer. This can lead to many kinds of reproductive disorders, and this can also increase a woman's risk for breast and ovarian cancers. Sometimes, due to population growth, this is one manifestation of population pressure. When population growth happens, or in cases where there are overpopulation. Obviously, consumption of food and other resources is going to increase in that area. And this can make people more inclined to homogenize their crops, which may not be a good thing. It affects the nutrients the person is going to absorb. When farmers, policymakers, practitioners in that area decide to homogenize their crops just to feed more people, this can decrease genetic variability among the existing crops in that area. And this in turn affects the food supply to the pathogens. And when this happens, when people are under pressure to feed more people because of increase in population, they may find alternatives like cheap food, may not be nutritious, may be unhealthy, or they may also look for genetically engineered crops as alternative, as supplement to feed this increased population. And homogenization of crops or decrease in genetic variability can lead to widespread hunger and disease, can lead to increase in food insecurity among population in that area. And high temperature in the given location can encourage insects in that area to breed. And the fluctuation of temperatures in that location can also shift the seasonal transmission of disease. COVID is one classic example. Flu is another example. And higher rainfall, sometimes due to human activities, sometimes due to climate change, sometimes due to global warming and other reasons. Higher rainfall can increase the outbreak of mosquito-borne disease. This can also increase the instances of parasite diseases, mainly through flooding. This can also contaminate our water supply because of how the waste flows through this rainfall, through different areas. And this can increase the exposure to runoff pesticides. So higher rainfall can have all kinds of environmental aversive outcomes. And global warming can lead to heat stress, especially in urban areas. Extreme weather events. If people cannot withstand this extreme weather, people may move or migrate to another areas. So the social implications of extreme weather events would be spousal separation, family separation. Sometimes it can be temporary, but periodic, or it can be permanent. People may never return. And this can affect fertility in the countries, the regions of origin. This can also affect reproductive health due to adverse weather outcomes. These can sometimes lead to fertility increase. If people move to another area, they don't know how to get access to contraception. They don't know how to get access, or they cannot afford other birth control mechanisms. These can temporarily increase the birth rates in that area. And sometimes people migrating because of weather can also lead to health improvement in the regions of origin. Maybe the regions of origin becomes less congested. And with less people fighting for less resources, people in that area may not need to homogenize crops. They may not need to utilize GMO products or cheap food. They can have healthier fruit products. And because of that, people migrating to other places due to extreme weather can improve the health of those remaining in the countries of areas of origin.